Our scripture today is found in the book of Matthew. We're looking once again at Matthew chapter 13. I forgot to change the chapter in the bulletin. Matthew 13, not Matthew 5. So, Matthew 13, verses 24 through 30, and verses 36 through 43. We are still talking about the parables, and it is interesting that the intermittent part that we're kind of skipping over is, again, Jesus explaining once again in the same chapter as we did 2 weeks ago why he speaks in parables. But we're going to be looking at the parable of the wheat and the tares. All right? Though as we're reading out of the NIV, they don't use the word tares, they use weeds. So, all right. If you're there, Matthew 13, verse 24. Jesus told them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like a man who sowed good seed in his field. But while everyone was sleeping, his enemy came and sowed weeds among the wheat and went away. When the wheat sprouted and formed heads, then the weeds also appeared. The owner's servants came to him and said, "Sir, didn't you sow good seed in your field? Where then did the weeds come from?" "An enemy did this," he replied. The servants asked him, "Do you want us to go and pull them up?" "No," he answered, "because while you are pulling the weeds, you may root up the wheat with them. Let both grow together until the harvest. At that time I will tell the harvesters, first collect the weeds and tie them in bundles to be burned. Then gather the wheat and bring it into my barn." And we're going to jump a little bit. Before we do that, we could look at that parable and we could start assigning things to that, right? It'd be really easy to go, oh, well, this is what that means, and here's what it is. And when I look at it, I think, well, we just got done the Matthew 13 passage we did 2 weeks ago. He was talking about a farmer sowing seeds, and the field happened to be the hearts of men, right? And so I could come to this passage and go, well, the field must be the hearts of men. And the seeds and the tares, that's our deeds, right? We could do that. But there's something nice about this. If we jump ahead to verse 36, we get our description from Christ, right? In verse 36 of Matthew chapter 13. Then he left the crowd and went into the house. The disciples came to him and said, "Explain to us the parable of the weeds in the field." See, because we need an explanation. Otherwise our minds go wild and we make up our own truth. And that's not really true, is it? So verse 37, he answered, "The one who sowed the good seed is the Son of Man. The field is the world, and the good seed stands for the sons of the kingdom. The weeds are the sons of the evil one, and the enemy who sows them is the devil. The harvest is the end of the age, and the harvesters are angels. As the weeds are pulled up and burned in the fire, so it will be at the end of the age. The Son of Man will send out his angels, and they will weed out of his kingdom everything that causes sin, and all who do evil. They will throw them into the fiery furnace, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Then the righteous will shine like the sun in the kingdom of the Father. He who has ears, let him hear." Right, so we see that we actually kind of need Christ's explanation because, well, the field wasn't the hearts of men, it's the world. Right? And so we have this parable and we have this explanation. So let's look at the two, right? So one of those things that it's important to note is Jesus likes to talk about the kingdom of heaven. Right? I have a friend, I love him dearly, and he said Jesus had one message, and that message was love. Right? And that's all Jesus really ever talked about was love. Well, it turns out that Jesus talks more about the kingdom of heaven than he does really anything else. And it seems as though this is one of those things that we ought to really pay attention. If Jesus talks about it a lot, maybe we ought to think about it and look at it and understand it. Right? And one of those things to think about is when he's talking about the kingdom of heaven, in this passage, the kingdom of heaven isn't a future thing. We have a tendency to think, well, the kingdom of heaven, that's when Christ comes back and we get brought up and we all get to reign for 1,000 years and all that stuff. No, the kingdom of heaven is now. All right? And this is one of those things like when we lived in West Edmonton, we had a friend across the street who was Eastern Orthodox, and he said, that's where you Baptists, you get it wrong. You think the kingdom of heaven is some future thing. It's now. And I said, no, we agree. It's now. It's in the Bible. Right? The kingdom of heaven is now. And this is one of the reasons why Christ talked about it so much. Not just, hey, someday in the future my teaching will be important, but right now you got to understand this is what's going on in the world. The kingdom of heaven is like a man who sowed good seed in the field. And we know from Jesus' explanation that the one who sowed the good seed is the Son of Man. And when we look at the Son of Man here, we find out that this is one of those phrases that Christ used to refer to himself. Consistently, Christ called himself the Son of Man. And he pulls this term, the Son of Man, he pulls it from a lot of different places. One of them we're going to look at in a little bit is Ezekiel was also called the Son of Man. When God spoke to Ezekiel and he gave Ezekiel prophets, he called Ezekiel the Son of Man. All right? But it's also pulled from the book of Daniel, where Daniel talks about some end time type thing, because yes, the kingdom of heaven is now, but there is some future aspect that we look at. And we see at the end times the Son of Man goes before the Ancient of Days, and they kind of have this discussion. Well, Christ is the Son of Man in Daniel. And the Son of Man in the area around them, what was this idea of the perfect man? The man, the image of what men are supposed to be. What the original intent of man was. And it was lifted up in the surrounding areas as a sense of he's actually a God in man type thing. And so when Jesus uses that term, Son of Man, all of that is in play. And so the perfect man, the perfect God-man, which only Jesus really fills completely, is the one who sows the seed. He sows the good seed. Now, it's interesting, he doesn't exactly tell us what the good seed is here. Right? And so we could speculate the good seed could be blessings, the good seed could be the word, the good seed could just be that spirit that draws us to God, that spirit that allows us to have faith. But the reality is that it is the Son of Man who plants the seed. Right? And he may use you and I to scatter it, but it is the Son of Man who plants it. Which is one of those things that always goes back to that idea of evangelism and how many people did you win to Christ? Well, the answer is 0. You know, I don't plant the seed. I may scatter it. I may share the love of Christ. I may tell people about it, but I don't do the winning. I don't do the saving. I had a pastor once say, well, I saved 5 people this week. I said, you saved 5 people? No, God saved 5 people, and you are blessed enough to have been used by God to do that. Right? The Son of Man sows the seed. He's the one who plants the seed. Okay? And so Jesus tells us that. And then he goes off and he talks about the field. All right? The field is the world. Now it's interesting. Jesus says the field is the world. And the reason why I say that's interesting is because when you look at theologians, they like to do weird things, right? And so I'm reading through some commentaries on this, and they come to this passage and they go, the field is the world, and it's actually the church. Like, well, no, Jesus didn't say the field is the church. He didn't say the field is the body of believers. He didn't say the field are those of faith. No, he said the field is the world. Right? And so, we have to understand that the seed is planted throughout the world. Right? That it's planted everywhere. It is not just the church. And he's not talking about the church here. He's not talking and saying, hey, weeds grow up in the church and good wheat grow up in the church. No, he's talking about the world. All right? So for us to limit it down to the church, well, we've kind of said, yeah, Jesus said it was the world, but Jesus, what does he know? You know? What is it? Well, it was his parable to begin with, but so we were looking not at the church here, we're looking at the world as the field. We're not looking at the individual hearts of men, we're looking at the hearts of every man, right? The seed has been sown throughout the world, and it was good seed. And we got to remember, it was good seed. The things that God plants are good, right? But then we have the enemy comes in and plants the bad seed, and they don't recognize that it's bad seed. And when we get down a little bit, when the seeds start to grow up and they start to see the fruit that's being borne by the plants, the harvesters, the angels, they say, wasn't the seed you planted good? Right? Wasn't it good seed? I said, yes, it was good seed. Right? And sometimes we look out in the world and we see evil things happening, and we see bad things happening, and we say, God, how could you allow this to happen? Aren't you a good God? Didn't you do good things? God says, no, yeah, what I put out there was good seed. But there are others out there who are planting. Right? An enemy came through, and he planted bad seed. And so we have this here. So the seed is good that God plants. But an enemy comes. And it's important to note there in verse 25, when the enemy comes and plants the bad seed, it says, but while everyone was sleeping. Other translations just say, but while men were sleeping, which I think is actually a better translation. Because otherwise you go, well, when the Son of God was sleeping, right? Because he'd be part of everyone, right? No, this is while men were sleeping. While you and I are sleeping, that's when the devil came and he sowed weeds. He put the bad seed in. Okay, and in your bulletin I have a couple of passages on that because I think it's important to think about that idea. About what happens while we're sleeping. And the first passage I have for us is found in Matthew chapter 26, verse 41. And this is in the Garden of Gethsemane. Jesus has taken his disciples. They've gone off to pray. And he takes the three, Peter, James, and John. He takes them off a little further. And he tells them, I want you to wait and watch with me while I pray. Right? And he says this in Matthew 26:41. Watch and pray lest you enter into temptation. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak. And what happens to them? Well, they fall asleep. I mean, they did just have a big meal. You know, all of us generally go, Thanksgiving, you have Thanksgiving 1 o'clock in the afternoon so that at 2 o'clock you can take a nap so that you can eat pie by 5, right? But we all we conk out. After big meals, they had a big meal. The spirit was willing, the flesh was weak. They couldn't wait and watch. They were told to watch. And what was the cost of not watching, of falling asleep? They would enter into temptation. If we aren't watching, if we aren't awake, the enemy comes in and he starts to plant the bad seed. Right? We have a passage in Ezekiel and Isaiah talking about the watchmen. Right? And I'll read the Isaiah passage first, actually. Isaiah 56:10. This is talking about the watchmen of Israel. He says, his watchmen are blind. They are all ignorant. They are all dumb dogs. They cannot bark. Sleeping, lying down, loving to slumber. Right? And so he says, look, the watchmen are sleeping, and so the enemy is going to come in. What we see in our passage, the enemy came in while they were sleeping. And then Ezekiel has this to say. But if the watchman, and this is Ezekiel 33, verse 6, if the watchman sees the sword coming and does not blow the trumpet, and the people are not warned, and the sword comes and takes any person from among them, he is taken away in his iniquity. But his blood I will require at the watchman's hand. So you, son of man, I have made you a watchman for the house of Israel. Therefore you shall hear a word from my mouth and warn them for me. When I say to the wicked, O wicked man, you shall surely die, and you do not speak to warn the wicked from his way, that wicked man shall die in his iniquity, but his blood I will require at your hand. Nevertheless, if you warn the wicked one to turn from his way, and he does not turn from his way, he shall die in his iniquity, but you have delivered your soul. And I read that passage because guess what? We are the watchmen. We are called to watch, to warn our fellow man, to say, hey, that is not right. And the reality is that is when we go to sleep that the devil comes in and starts saying, hey, how about this? What about this? When we look at our society today and wonder, how did we get here? Well, the answer is because too many watchmen were sleeping. Too many watchmen were sleeping, and the devil went out and sowed the seeds. So we need to be vigilant. We need to watch. We need to be careful of what we allow to be planted. Right? And so he sowed the weeds among the wheat. And then there's this one part. And he went away. You know, this is one of the things about the devil. We all like to think that he has to be there to kind of push us. And no, he sowed the seed and he walks away. He sowed the seed, he walked away. Right? And then the wheat sprouts up and it forms heads, and the weeds also appear. And we don't have to question, what is the wheat? What is the weeds? Well, it turns out that the wheat, those are the believers. Right? Those are the sons of the kingdom, as Jesus says. The citizens of heaven. They're you and I. The one who have taken in the seed of God and grown up into fruitful wheat plants. And the weeds, the tares, as it is in the King James, I like that word tares. I don't know why. They are the sons of the evil one. Right? They're the sons of the enemy. They are lost people. They're lost. They don't know better. You know, a weed cannot help but be a weed. It didn't say one day, hey, I want to be a weed. You know what, look at me, I'm just going to be... dandelions are weeds in my book, but in my wife's books, you can eat every part, so they're good, right? You can make tea, and Daniel just goes out and picks them and eats them. It's like, dog peed on that, don't do that. Right? It's still a weed. Weed can't help but be a weed. The dandelion can't help but be the dandelion. Right? And so we should not be angry with the weed for being a weed. We just got to recognize that it is what it is. Right? And it's interesting, and I have a note in this particular Bible that says that these weeds were probably, and they have the name for the plant, darnel, which is a plant that grows up that looks like wheat until it starts to bear the fruit. And so they couldn't tell. Early on, they looked at it and they couldn't tell if it was a wheat or a weed. They just knew that something wasn't right. Right? And you know, sometimes you look at people and you can't tell. Not until you see the fruit. Not until you see what they're doing. And so the owner's servants, when they realize, hey, we've got some weeds here, we've got some wheat, they come to the owner and they say, sir, did you sow good seed? Yes, it was an enemy who did this. You know how he knows it was an enemy who did this? Because he was not sleeping. Right? God does not sleep. God knows what's going on. God understands, he sees it all. And so the servants asked him, do you want us to go and pull them up? Right? And this tends to be our question. All right, well, there are lost people in the world. Should we get rid of them? You know? That seems to be the church's question for generations, and they keep coming down with this, oh yeah, we should just get rid of them, right? We call it the Crusades, we call it the Spanish Inquisition, we have lots of, no, we don't just get rid of them, right? He says, no, he answered, because while you're pulling out the weeds, you may root up the wheat with them. We don't get rid of the lost just because they're lost. Remember, they look very similar to the saved sometimes, and so you might not know, and you might think, hey, that one's lost, and I'll pull it out and find out, no, that one wasn't lost. That was actually a piece of wheat, which is why I do no weeding in the garden. Sarah's like, you want to help me weed? If you don't mind me pulling up everything that's green, because it all looks the same to me, right? Except for the strawberry plants. I weed the strawberry plants because I can tell the difference. They got weird, funky shapes to their leaves, right? But the reality is that when we're with the tomatoes and those things, I don't know the difference. You don't want me to pull up all the tomato plants. That'd be bad, right? Well, we don't want to go out and weed the world because we might be pulling out the Christians. And the reality is, there's always potential that they might become a Christian, right? And so we don't want to rip them out because we might rip out the good fruit. And there's this idea of, hey, no, because while you are pulling the weeds, you may root up the wheat with them. Well, hey, you know what happened when we look back at the Spanish Inquisition? Because the Spanish Inquisition was a really bad time in the church, right? Where the church went out and they said, hey, you don't believe what we believe, we're going to torture you until you agree to believe what we believe, and then we'll kill you, right? Well, a lot of people look back at the Spanish Inquisition and go, well, I can't believe any faith that would be anything near that would have anything to do with that has any resemblance to that. And they did this in the name of Christ. You know what happens as a result of the crusade? People look back and go, I can have nothing to do with a church that has this in their history. Okay? And you know, we're Baptists. We weren't the guys who went out on the crusades. But people still, well, you believe the same Bible, you believe in the same God, you believe in Jesus, and it was done in the name of Jesus, and so we can't believe in the name of Jesus because these things were done in his name. Right? Because somebody thought, hey, it'd be a good idea to go get those infidels out of the Holy Land. Right? Because there was bad seed sown. And the servants wanted to rip it out. Let's get rid of it. The reality is that God doesn't call us to get rid of the lost. He doesn't call us to weed the garden in this case. He calls us to exist among them, to grow despite them. Despite of. Let's go with in spite of them. Right? Not to spite them, but they're there, we're there. He doesn't call us to say, all right, now let's take all the Christians out. Because, you know, that's the other option. Instead of pulling out all the weeds, we pull out the wheat and go replant it somewhere else. Which, you know, there are lots of people who try to do that. Let's create this Christian community that's only Christian. And we won't let anything else in. Well, you know what happens to those communities? They don't spread the gospel. They fail to do what they're called to do. Right? And he says, no, you're going to exist amongst the world. Right? Because the reality is if you take us out of the world, if you take us out, the light disappears from the darkness. We talked about that last week, right? That we are the light in the darkness. The light of Christ shines through us. And we can't be taken out, otherwise there's no hope for the world. So he says, no, you cannot. You cannot pull up the weeds. As the weeds are pulled up over in verse 40 and burned in the fire, right? At the end, when everything is done, this is the harvest, that's the future event. Everything else is the right now event. Right? At the end, when we have harvested, we will separate the wheat from the weeds. And the weeds will be thrown into the fire. Right? We were watching, we go through these weird binges every once in a while. We've been watching different things on YouTube, partly because we watch the choruses so that we can sing praise songs, because, we have a hard time with the new songs, Sarah and I do, just because I don't know them. Sarah's not great at carrying a tune. She's an alto. Nothing's written in the right register for her. It's not that she's not a good musician. Don't get me. All right? So we watch these choruses. And as we're watching the choruses, we see other things on YouTube. And one of them was 6 views on hell that are wrong. And one of the views happened to be from a minister that I really liked. I really appreciate his preaching. And it turned out that he was giving wrong views as illustrations in his sermon. But one of the guys in one of the videos said, people say, well, we don't preach about hell because, we only preach what Jesus talked about. And, we go back to that, well, Jesus only talked about love, right? Well, no, he's talking about the kingdom of heaven right here. And it turned out one of the pastors who was actually giving the proper viewpoint said, hell is actually talked about more by Jesus than anywhere else in the Bible. Right? And so if we say we only preach what Jesus talked about, then we kind of should be preaching about hell a little bit. And this is one of his passages, right? The reality is that those weeds, the sons of the evil one, those who aren't saved, they're going to be tossed into the lake of fire. Judgment is coming, right? They're going to be burned in fire. And so it will be at the end of the age, Jesus said. Right? The Son of Man will send out his angels, and they will weed out of his kingdom everything that causes sin, and all who do evil. They will throw them into the fiery furnace, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Right? There will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. It's not a place of annihilation. It's not a place of, you just do whatever you want, I'm going to hell because they know how to party in hell. It's not what it is. And it's not a place where the devil is there torturing you. No, it's a place where you're torturing yourself. It's a place that is just abysmal. And you know what that place really is when it comes down to it? It's outside of the love and the grace and the mercy of God. It's a place of the wrath of God just being poured out. Right? And so we can't escape that. That is the destination for the weeds. Which, to be frank, to be honest, is one of the reasons why we need to make sure that we're watching. That we are sharing with the people around us, that we call things out. Because we don't want to see people go to hell. Now, we don't use hell as you better believe when you go to hell. We don't want to scare them into heaven because that doesn't work. And it's like a shotgun wedding. They don't work. Right? 5 years down the road, the two of them don't work together. You don't marry somebody because you're afraid their dad's going to kill you. In fact, you generally don't marry them when you're afraid their dad's going to kill you. Right? I'm still somewhat afraid of my mother-in-law. Right? And she didn't hear that though. So we'll have to tell her that later. She's the one that I thought was going to kill me. Right? But the reality is, you don't scare somebody into heaven. You don't scare them out of hell. But we warn them because hell is a real place. We act out of that sense that we don't want to see you go there because we love you so much. But we can't deny that hell is a real place. And that people will be there. And that it will be a place of suffering. There will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Right? But that's not the only place, right? That's not the only place. In verse 43, then the righteous will shine like sons in the kingdom of their Father. He who has an ear, let him hear. Or in verse 30 over there. then gather the wheat and bring it into my barn. Right? And see, that's the joy that we have, knowing that we are the wheat, knowing that we belong to God, knowing that we are His children, that one day He will gather us together and we will be with Him in glory, in a perfect place. And at that point, at the end of the age, when God has done the harvest, then all the evil will be gone. All the evil will be put out. You know, those little discrepancies we have in our own hearts where we may think evil thoughts, we may do evil things, God will remove them. But until that day comes, we need to watch. We need to keep an eye out for the wicked one who wants to sow the seeds of iniquity, who wants to make sons of the wicked one. Will you bow with me in prayer?